Okay, so we have now downloaded and installed Blender. So next we want to, in our Blender folder, unzip this Learn Blender Now Starter Kit file we downloaded. And if you haven't downloaded that, you can download it in the description of this video. What we want to do, if you don't have an archiving/zipping program to open up archived or zip files, you can. The one I use is called JZip, and if you just type in JZip into Google, you can download that, and it's free and works great. So I'm going to select that file and click extract here. So now we have that file open. I'm going to go ahead and delete this zip file because I don't need it, and I'm obsessive. So if I already have it there, I don't need it, so I'm going to delete it. Okay, so inside of this, we find several things in here. There's a file, Bsf Custom Ui, Bsf Key Configuration.py, add mesh walls, and a add-on list. The add-on list is actually just a JPEG image of all the different add-ons I have installed in Blender, which are most of the ones that it comes with by default, but I just wanted to go ahead and make a list, so we'll be checking this later. Alright, so what we want to go ahead and do here is click on the Bsf Custom Ui file. Okay, as you can see, this layout is quite a bit different from the original layout you get when you first install Blender. And there's also a lot of conventions and things I've changed, which anybody can change. You can create your layout to look however you want, but this is going to be the one we'll be using for this series. So if I go ahead and click Window, Toggle Full Screen, that puts you in and out of full screen mode. And so I've cleaned up the interface, or what I consider to be cleaning up the interface quite a bit. But we want to keep this layout. So the first thing what we want to do is in this little window here, in this little box here, we want to select user preferences. And if we go to File up here in these tabs and we check mark off of Load UI, this will keep this layout the same no matter whose file you open up on Blender. So we want to click that off, and we'll change this back to 3D view, and we want to go to File, Save User Settings. And now every time you open up Blender, I'll go ahead and close this out, File, Quit, and I'll open up my programs, Blender Foundation, Blender, click Blender. And now I have the same setup. And so there are a few more things, and I know this is all probably very confusing and intimidating, but there's just a few things we want to just get in there real quick like a ninja and get taken care of out of the way before we really dive into this. And so we're about halfway through. So let's go back over to this other window and change it to the user preferences. And we're going to have to kind of go along each one of these tabs and change a few things to finish setting up the Blender Sensei format, which is good because we can kind of go over a few things in the preferences. So we'll click on Interface first. And under here, we want to select auto depth. We want to rotate around selection, and we want auto perspective. Auto depth is use the depth under the mouse to improve paint. Yeah, okay. We're going to turn off the manipulator because the way we'll be using and what the manipulator is, if I switch this back to 3D view, well, I turned it off. So let me go to user preferences, turn it on, and then back to 3D view. what the manipulator is this giant XYZ thing, which you can select the arrows and move it across. I'm going to hit Control Z to put that back. But the way that we'll be using Blender, this really just gets in the way more than anything, and because there's a much more efficient, much more intuitive way to handle moving. So I'm going to go User Preferences and turn Manipulator off. And next, under Editing, most of this is set up how I typically use it. This is all pretty good. Under Input, there's a bunch of things down here we're going to change, and then we're also going to import a key configuration. Continuous grab, that we want selected. What that basically, if I switch this back to a 3D view, see the mouse, well, it's not. If I select this object and I hit G to grab it, and you see as my mouse goes over to the right, it comes right back through the left of the screen. And what this allows you to do is when you're making an adjustment to something, you don't have to, your mouse isn't stopped at the end of the screen, so you can't keep moving it. You can keep moving it as far as you need to. So I'm going to hit Control Z to put that back. And I grabbed this object, or I moved it with the right mouse button. We're also going to change that. So let's switch this window back to User Preferences and select with, now some Blender traditionalists, of course, by default, you select things with the right mouse button, but you know, using a computer on a daily basis and having to basically select everything else with the left mouse button on every other program that exists, just to keep things more simple in my mind, I like to choose Select with Left. We also want to select Emulate Numpad. That's important if you're on a laptop also, because by default your top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on button number buttons that are above your keys, like your Q, W, E, R, T, Y keys, those numbers control, if I switch back to 3D view, those numbers control which layer you're selected on. And you see here is your layers. You see there's a little yellow dot right there, and that yellow dot represents that there's objects in this layer. So if I click over to another layer, there's nothing. If I hold Shift and click on multiple layers, they'll all be open at the same time. But by default, your top numbers on your keyboard control different layers. And that, for the most part, to me is, I don't need really hotkeys to be able to switch back and forth between layers. That's pretty easily done with my mouse, and I don't do it that often, so I just don't need keys to do that. Much more useful of these keys is to be able to change your views, as you see I'm doing now. And this is because under User Preferences we have, and this is under Input, we have Emulate Numpad. Because if that's not on, your views are controlled by the number pad on like a big regular desktop keyboard. So anyway, if we go back to this 3D view and we change it back to the User Preferences, and we are in the Input tab, as we go down, so we have Emulate Numpad selected. These are all okay, this is all fine. So now what we want to do is import key configuration. Under this Input tab, as you see all these windows, if we press these arrows down, these contain all of Blender's different commands for the different various menus and different things, and every single one of them can be customized. You can make any button that does something be another button or mouse or whatever. And I've actually customized a lot of these these different functions to be more efficient to my workflow. So what we're going to do is click Import Key Configuration, and you'll see this is Blender's folder system. So you have system bookmarks, which is great. You can bookmark a folder. I usually like to have my textures and models and resources bookmarked here so I can immediately click to them and get to them. And then of course you can select by drive, and you can collapse all of these. You can add the bookmarks here. Once you've navigated to a folder you want to bookmark, and they'll show up here. So what we want to do is, since I have that Blender folder with the Blender Sensei format files on the desktop, I'm going to click the desktop. If you have yours saved on your hard drive, you might want to click it there to get to it, or however you need to navigate to it. But I'm going to click that Blender folder. There's the Learn Blender Now Starter Kit. I'm going to select bsf keyconfig.py and double click that. And this has now imported all my special keys I've set up. And I don't change a lot of things drastically. There's just most of the idea behind my workflow is that I want most of my hotkeys on the left side of the keyboard. I do not want to have to constantly be going back and forth all the way over to the right side of the keyboard to do stuff. And also I have customized several things to that just make a lot more sense to me. So if I change this back to the 3D view and go ahead and click File and Save User Settings. Okay, so actually I want to go back to User Preferences, and under Add-ons, these are the add-ons that come with Blender, and you can actually select them by category of what they do. Like, these are user related. Enabled shows all the ones that are currently checkmarked, and disabled shows basically everything else. And the ones related to 3D view, adding a curve, adding a mesh, and don't worry if you don't understand what any of this means. Just know that these are the categories of different add-ons. But what I have done, if we navigate back to, and if you're on a PC, you might actually find some good use out of that little Windows button while you're in Blender, because I like to keep full screen turned on in Blender, and I basically just navigate to other stuff by hitting my Windows key. So if I go back to desktop and that Blender folder we have, and then the Learn Blender Now Starter Kit, and I click the add-on list image, we can see all of the add-ons that I have selected, and these are everything you're going to need for this tutorial series, and will also just be really great to have. So what I'm going to do is actually minimize this window, and I'm going to close that out, and I'm going to window toggle full screen, and I'm going to pull this over here so that I can, and it looks like my window's bugging out a little bit, but that's fine. So I can see, if I click on Enabled, and then I can compare all the different ones that are on here. Let's see. And the first one I think that we don't have enabled is the Game Engine Save as Game Engine Runtime. And we won't be really doing much stuff with the game engine here in this tutorial series, but that's one that I like to keep on. So I'm going to click under Game Engine and turn that on, and then I'm going to go back to Enabled. Let's see, what else? Import Autodesk, BioVision, and most of these are just ones that are come on by default, and that's why they're part of this group. But might as well just for consistency's sake, make sure these are all the same. And what else? Import images planes, that's one we definitely want to have on. And that one would be under import export. And let's find that. Let's see. Import images planes. We'll select that. While we're in this import export, let's see what else we have selected. Well, let's see. I'm going to have to click over here and I go to enabled. And comparing this, let's see. STL format, scalable vector graphics, standard PLY, UV layout, yes. Waveform, Web 3D, render cycles engines by default. Okay, so we want to make sure that the Mesh B-Surfaces GPL edition is selected in here. That's going to be very important to what we're doing. So under Mesh, I assume, and we can turn that on. Go back to enabled, and additionally under here I believe the Rigify, which is a human bone armature setup for humanoid type characters, and also don't be intimidated by that. It's not as scary as it sounds, but we'll be getting into that later. So let's go into rigging and turn on Rigify. Make sure it's checkmarked, go back to enabled. And I think that about does it. The last one that we want to do is, if you see this Add Mesh Wall Factory, this is actually, I've done a lot of tutorials on using this to create castles and explosions and things like that. Some really cool stuff. But this is actually not by default in Blender. So what we're going to have to do, it's inside of the folder that it is inside is the Learn Blender Now Blender Sensei Format Starter Kit. So we're going to have to install that manually. So that's going to be good to know how to install an add-on manually if you need to do that. So that pretty much sums it up for the add-ons we want installed. So I'm going to X that out. And I'm going to go ahead and change this back to 3D view. I'm going to hit my Windows key, and this button here I just have basically set up to open up my internet, or not internet browser, but my Windows Explorer browser. But you can just go to your desktop or minimize Blender or whatever. So I'm going to click on the desktop folder, which contains everything on the desktop, and under the Learn Blender Now Starter Kit, I'm going to right click and copy this entire Add Mesh Walls folder. And then what I want to do is go to Computer, C, Program Files, Blender Foundation, Blender 2.65 is the current version I have installed. That's just some old 2.64 data, but we're going to click 2.65 or whatever version you have downloaded. And then under Scripts, Add-ons, and I'm going to right click and paste. Then I can close this out, and if I go back to my user preferences and I click on Mesh, I now, well, what is it? Add Mesh, I guess. I now see the option for this Add Mesh Wall Factory, which would not have been there had we not just copy and pasted that folder into the add-ons folder inside of our programs, scripts, Blender, or whatever, all that stuff. We're going to click it, and that will install it. And if we, going down the line, if we click on themes, you can change all the color schemes of like I was talking about before. Each one of these segments in Blender is just a different window with one of these different editor types. And you can change them to whatever you like, and then you can also change the color scheme of each one of them. So currently everything now is pretty much gray, but if you for some reason down the road wanted to change the color schemes, you can do that. I'm not going to fool with that right now. But we'll go down to File, and nothing really too much needs to change here. The only thing that we changed is earlier was we unchecked Load UI, so that whenever you load someone else's Blender file or something like that, your user interface, the way you have all your windows and all your properties and everything set up, stays the same. So, so this is all pretty good. And lastly, under System, there's a few things you might want to check on here and maybe read up a little bit more about on blender.org. But under the compute device, I just have CPU selected, which means that that Blender will render with my processor, and I have a hexacore processor, which is a super dope, crazy huge processor. So I have it set up to CPU. However, if you're like a mad gamer and you have some kind of super badass or graphics card or twin graphics card, then that may appear under an option under here to render with, and you may want to select that because it may outdo your processor. And everything else here is, basically set up pretty decently. So let's go ahead and go back to 3D view, and let's File, Save User Settings, and we are pretty much set up, good to go. We've downloaded and installed Blender. We've set up the Blender Sensei format, and next I want to just do kind of a brief overview of Blender user interface, and also some modifications I've made with the Blender Sensei format, and then we can really dive into this tutorial series. Alright, stick around.